They called him a monster, a giant of a man who lived alone on a dusty ranch, his shoulders as wide as a barn door and his voice as rare as summer rain. The folks in Dry Creek whispered that his silence was a sign of a dark temper, that his strength was a curse waiting to be unleashed. They called him Hartwell, the giant rancher, and they stayed clear. And then there was the woman. Her name was Jessamine, and she arrived with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a shadow in her eyes. 30 years old, no husband, no family to speak of. She took a job tending Hartwell's horses, a job for a man, and the town's whispers turned into a roar. They called her fragile. They called her foolish. When the whiskey flowed, they called her much worse. But they didn't know the truth about the giant, and they had no idea what the woman was running from. Every day, Jessamine moved beneath the weight of 2 water buckets, her arms trembling not from weakness but from pure, stubborn will. She was a small thing against the vast, empty prairie, a dark figure fighting a battle no one else could see. Colton Hartwell watched her from his porch. He saw the raw, red blisters on her hands, the flesh worn down by rope and shovel. He saw her flex her fingers, saw the silent debate in her posture. Scream or keep moving. She always chose to keep moving. He remembered the day she arrived. She hadn't looked at him, not directly, but he'd seen the shame she carried. It bent her back just slightly, an invisible weight of judgment. He never asked her story. A man with his own ghosts knows better than to pry at the wounds of others. But as he watched her stumble, spilling a dark trail of water on the thirsty dirt, something in his chest tightened. He almost stepped forward. Almost. But his size had frightened women before. His shadow had crushed softer moments. So he stayed still, watching as she set the buckets down, her hands shaking so hard she had to press them against her skirt. When she lifted her head, her eyes caught the last bit of dying light, and for just a second he saw it. Defiance. A stubborn glint, like a star refusing to be swallowed by the night. She turned and disappeared into the stables, leaving the buckets behind. Defeated, or so it seemed. The sun bled out on the horizon, and the coyotes began their nightly call. Colton finally stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He walked to the abandoned buckets, his hand wrapped around the iron handle, the weight barely a whisper to him, but he carried them slowly, carefully, as if they were made of glass. He poured the remaining water into the trough, the ripples catching the first stars. He stood there for a long time, the smell of hay and horse sweat drifting from the dark stable. He thought of her blisters, a body breaking itself to prove its worth to a world that was just waiting to laugh. He knew that feeling. His own calluses told the story of a man who had built walls, not just with his hands, but around his heart. Then he heard it, her voice, soft and low, speaking to the horses. "Easy now," she murmured, and the gentleness in her tone was startling. A horse nickered in reply, and then came another sound, one he hadn't heard on this ranch in years. Laughter. It was brief, quiet, but it cut through the silence like a lantern in the dark. Colton turned back toward his empty house, but the sound followed him. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt the world shift. Inside the stable, her lantern cast a faint glow, spilling golden stripes into the darkness. He watched until the light wavered, and then went out. He stood there, a giant framed against the night, faced with a choice. Remain the man who keeps his distance, or step into the quiet battle unfolding in his own barn. As the first cold wind of the night swept across the prairie, he felt something he'd buried long ago begin to stir. The decision, though unspoken, was already made. The saloon in Dry Creek was where truths went to die. Laughter rattled against the smoky air, and men who'd done nothing all day leaned on the bar, their spurs jingling as they passed judgment. And that night, Jessamine's name was on every tongue. A woman, out at Hartwell's place, muttered Deputy Rance Calloway, his badge dull in the lamplight. It ain't natural. A ranch hand named Ezekiel Crowder, a man with a grin as sharp as a broken bottle, chimed in. A giant like Hartwell, and her, all blisters and desperation, folks are already talking. Widow Belle McGraw, perched on her usual stool like a vulture, fanned herself slowly. Desperate is the word. A woman her age, alone, taking on ranch work? Tell me, what is she running from? Their laughter was like spilled whiskey, warm at first, then bitter. Jessamine heard them the next morning. She'd come to town for supplies, her few coins tucked deep in her pocket. As she passed the saloon, their words and laughter spilled out into the street. Delicate, desperate, running. She didn't stop, didn't look up, but she felt their judgment cling to her like burrs. She had known ridicule before, but here, in a place where she just wanted her work to be enough, the sting was sharper. Back at the ranch, she buried herself in the stables. The smell of hay and leather was her only comfort. She stroked a young foal, whispering to it. "Hush now, you're not alone," she murmured, her voice trembling. The words were as much for her as they were for the horse. Colton was in the shadows of the barn. He'd come for a bridle, but her voice stopped him. He'd heard the gossip, too. It didn't surprise him. He'd been their target for years. But hearing her carry the weight of it, watching her gentle the foal even as her own spirit was breaking, it made the walls around his own heart crack just a little. He didn't want to shame her by offering help. Pride was all a person had sometimes. So later, he left a small tin of salve on the bench where she kept her tools. He placed it there quietly, as if it had always been there, and then he left. That evening, he saw the tin was gone. He said nothing. She said nothing. But the next morning, her raw hands were wrapped in clean white bandages, and the stubborn set of her shoulders seemed just a little bit lighter. The unspoken truth hung between them. He had seen her pain, and he had offered comfort without a word. It was a language they were both starting to understand. But the town wasn't done talking. The whispers grew louder, twisting into something uglier. Jessamine tried to ignore them, but the words gnawed at her in the quiet of the night. How long before they drove her out? Maybe she should just leave, disappear before the inevitable happened. One afternoon, under a sun that scorched the very air, she was trying to lift a heavy pail of water. Her bandaged palms screamed in protest. The bucket slipped, splashing muddy water all down her skirt. A moment of pure humiliation. And then she saw him, Crowder, leaning against a fence post, that same ugly smirk on his face. "Figure this kind of work ain't for you, miss?" he drawled, his voice loud enough for anyone to hear. "Best leave it to them that know how. Ain't no shame in quittin' before you break." His words, thrown right in her face, were sharper than any gossip. Jessamine's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. She just turned back to the trough, trying to gather what little dignity she had left. Crowder chuckled, a sound like a rattlesnake's warning, and sauntered off. But he didn't get far, because Colton had seen it all. He walked from the barn toward the trough, each step slow, deliberate, heavy as thunder. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Crowder saw him coming and his face went pale. The smirk vanished. Colton's silence was more powerful than any shout. The giant just stood there, his shadow falling over the smaller man, and the air crackled with a threat that needed no voice. Crowder muttered an excuse and practically ran back to the bunkhouse. Jessamine was frozen, still holding the bucket. She expected Colton to scold her, to pity her. Instead, he just bent down, gently took the handle from her shaking fingers, and lifted the pail as if it were empty. He set it on the edge of the trough. Then he looked at her, his eyes steady, his jaw tight. He turned and walked away, leaving her in a silence that was more comforting than any words could have been. That night, She unwrapped the bandages and applied the cool salve to her palms. The pain was still there, but it was different now. It was softened by something she couldn't name. His silence had been a shield. It had protected her without shaming her. Lying in the dark, she could still feel his presence at the trough, a wordless barrier between her and the cruelty of the world. She told herself it was just decency. But the memory burned brighter than that. The town's whispers were a storm outside her door, but inside, a different, quieter question was taking root. At dawn, she tightened her bandages and stepped out to face the day. She had no idea that Dry Creek's gossip was about to turn into something far more dangerous. The next strike wouldn't just be words. It would be designed to break her for good. The summer heat settled over the plains like a suffocating blanket. On the ranch, an unspoken language was growing between Colton and Jessamine, a language built of quiet actions, not words. One morning, she fought with a rusted stable door, the old wood groaning in protest. She put her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth, but it wouldn't budge. She finally gave up in frustration. But when she came back that evening, the door swung open smooth and silent. The hinge was oiled, the bolts tightened. No one said a word, but she knew. She knew it was him. A few days later, she noticed the shoulder seam of his work shirt was torn, the threads worn thin from years of hard labor. That night, by the light of her small lamp, she carefully stitched it back together. Her fingers, though still tender, were nimble. She left the folded shirt on a chair by his door before dawn. He wore it the next day. He didn't thank her. She didn't mention it. But as he passed her in the barn, his gaze held hers for just a second longer than usual. It was a silent acknowledgement. A thank you. A bond was forming, like dry kindling waiting for a spark. But beyond the ranch, the world was getting uglier. Crowder, embarrassed by Colton, went back to muttering his poison among the other hands. He didn't dare confront her again. Not directly, but his hateful smirk followed her everywhere, waiting for her to fail. She held her head high, but his presence was a constant, tightening knot in her chest. Then the storm came. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thunder rolled across the prairie. Jessamine was in the pasture when the first bolt of lightning split the heavens. The horses screamed, their panic exploding across the field. Without a thought, she ran toward them, her skirts tangling in the tall grass, trying to calm the terrified animals. But the herd, spooked by the fire in the sky, bolted toward the fence, threatening to break through and scatter for miles. Suddenly, Colton was there, a dark shape against the flashing lightning. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, his deep, steady voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Together, they fought the chaos. Rain lashed down, soaking them to the bone, plastering their clothes with mud. Jessamine's raw palms burned as she gripped the ropes. A big mare reared up, its eyes wild with terror, and the rope was ripped from her grasp, scorching her skin. She cried out, stumbling back, bracing for the horse to trample her, but then an arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back. Colton's grip was firm, his voice in her ear, cutting through the thunder. "Enough," he said. It wasn't a question. He took the rope from her, his one hand easily controlling the frantic horse. Jessamine staggered back, the rain hiding the hot tears that stung her eyes. It wasn't weakness. It was the overwhelming relief of being protected, even for a moment. When the last of the herd was safely in the stable, they stood in the dim lantern light, dripping and exhausted. The rain hammered on the roof. Jessamine cradled her hands, the blisters torn open and bleeding. Colton reached for her wrists. She flinched, but something in his steady gaze held her still. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle as he examined her palms. He said nothing. He just turned and came back with clean strips of cloth. He carefully wrapped her hands, his head bowed in concentration. She watched the rainwater drip from his hair, the flickering lantern light softening the hard lines of his face. The silence was filled with unspoken things: patience, respect, a deep, quiet understanding of her pain. "They'll say I don't belong here," she whispered, just to break the quiet. "They already do." He finished tying the bandage and finally looked up at her. His eyes, shadowed and intense, met hers. "Let them talk," he murmured, his voice like gravel. "Dust don't stick if you keep moving." The simple words hit her harder than any grand speech. She had expected pity or maybe dismissal. Instead, he had given her kinship. For the first time since she'd arrived in this miserable town, she didn't feel completely alone. The storm passed. At dawn, the world was washed clean. Colton was already in the yard, mending the fence that had been splintered by the panicked herd. He didn't look up as she walked past, but she felt his eyes on her, an invisible tether connecting them. Their silent exchanges continued. She'd leave a cup of hot coffee by his tools. He'd replace a cracked handle on her shovel. Each small act was a word in their private language. But the town was watching. One evening, Crowder was back at his post, leaning against the corral fence, his eyes full of malice. This time, when he smirked at her, Jessamine didn't look away. She stared right back. Before he could speak, Colton's shadow fell over him once again. Crowder's smirk faltered. The giant just stood there, unblinking. After a long, tense moment, Crowder spat on the ground and slunk away. Colton turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought he might finally say something, might finally break the heavy silence between them. But he just tipped his hat and walked back to the barn. She stood there, her bandaged palms tingling, her heart caught in the space his words had not filled. The air smelled of rain and earth, a reminder of the storm that had passed, and a warning of the one that was still to come. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the next storm wouldn't be made of rain and lightning. It would be made of the hatred in the hearts of men. The heat returned to Dry Creek, but now it carried something else. Suspicion. It was in the air, in the way people stopped talking when Jessamine entered the general store. The place had become a courtroom, and every glance was a judgment. The whispers had grown since the storm. The image of her and the giant rancher, standing together against the lightning, had fueled the town's ugly imagination. The rumors finally reached the law. Sheriff Dalton Graves was a man who looked like he was carved from petrified wood. He found Jessamine by the flour barrels, his boots echoing on the floorboards. His gaze pinned her in place. "Miss Rohr," he said, his voice flat and heavy. "A word." She followed him out onto the boardwalk. The sun was blinding. People on the street slowed their pace, leaning in to listen. "There's talk," the sheriff began, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Talk that your presence out at Hartwell's place is stirring up trouble. This town don't take kindly to things it don't understand." Shame rose in her throat like a cloud of dust. She couldn't speak. He studied her for a long moment. "You'd be wise to consider how much longer you plan on staying." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The words hit her like stones. She turned and walked away, clutching her basket, not daring to look back. The sheriff of Dry Creek had just told her to get out of town. Back at the ranch, she retreated to her small room, the walls closing in on her. She couldn't look at Colton. She couldn't bear the thought of telling him she'd been run off. That night, she sat in the dark, the sheriff's words echoing in her head. Leaving felt like a snake coiling in her gut. Would it silence the town? Would it protect Colton from the scandal she'd brought to his door? The thought was a hollow ache in her chest. A few days later, the town held a meeting about irrigation rights, but no one was talking about water. As the room filled with the smell of sweat and tobacco, Jessamine became the real topic of conversation. "It ain't proper," declared Widow McGraw, her fan beating a furious rhythm. "A woman living under a man's roof with no bond of blood or marriage. It makes the whole town look lawless." Crowder, his grin full of poison, added, "She calls herself a stable woman." We all know what kind of stable some women keep. The laughter was cruel and sharp. Jessamine, sitting in the back, felt every word like a physical blow. Her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to stand, to scream, but her voice was gone. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. Colton rose. His size commanded the room. The muttering stopped. Everyone stared as the giant rancher stood to his full height. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "That woman," he said, his tone as flat and hard as the prairie in winter, "has worked harder than any man in this room. She harms no one. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Widow McGraw, never one to back down, sneered, "So you defend her, Hartwell? You make her your cause?" His jaw tightened. For a second, Jessamine thought he would back down, but his gaze swept the room, cold and unyielding. "I defend fairness," he said. "That's all." The meeting fell apart after that. Jessamine slipped out before Colton could see her, her heart torn between gratitude and a fresh wave of humiliation. He had defended her, but in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand. Now they were on one side, and the whole town was on the other. She found herself at the edge of the prairie that evening, the tall grass whispering in the wind. She pressed her hands to her face, fighting back hot tears of shame. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. She didn't have to turn. "I should go," she said, her voice breaking. "They're right. My staying only brings trouble to you." The silence stretched out. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with a pain that was years old. "You think I don't know what it's like? To be watched? To be called a monster? My wife? She believed them. She let their whispers turn her heart cold against me. I buried her, and I've felt their stares ever since." The confession hung in the twilight air. Jessamine turned to look at him. He was staring at the horizon, his face a mask of old scars. "They'll never stop talking," he said. "Not about me, not about you. But their talk don't break us, not unless we let it." Something inside her shifted. It wasn't that the shame disappeared, but in its place, a small hard seed of defiance began to grow. She had come to Dry Creek to escape judgment, only to find a new, harsher kind, but she wasn't running anymore. They walked back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the shared weight of survival. But the town wasn't finished. The rumors grew more vicious, fueled by Crowder's bitterness. Soon the story was that she was more than just a stable hand. The lies spread like a disease. One evening, returning from a quick trip for supplies, Jessamine saw the steady glow of Colton's lantern in the stable. She watched him work, his powerful shoulders bent to his task, and her resolve hardened. She would not let them win. But as she turned to go to her room, a flicker of movement near the fence caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. It was Crowder. He paused just at the edge of the lantern light, and a cruel, patient smile spread across his face. Jessamine froze. The night air suddenly felt cold and tight. He was only there for a moment before melting back into the darkness, but the look in his eyes left no doubt. The town's judgment was no longer just gossip. It had become a promise of violence. And its next strike was coming soon. The night was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the heavy, waiting silence that comes before something terrible happens. Jessamine lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of Crowder's twisted smile was burned into her mind. The town's words had bruised her spirit, but that look promised something far worse. Then she smelled it. A faint, acrid scent on the wind. At first, she thought it was just dust, but then it grew stronger, sharper. It was the smell of smoke, hungry smoke. She sat bolt upright, her heart seizing in her chest. A flickering orange glow pulsed against her window curtain. It wasn't the moon. It was fire. By the time she threw open her door, the night had exploded into a nightmare. Flames were licking up the walls of the stable, smoke boiling into the black sky. Inside, the horses were screaming, their hooves thundering against the stall doors like a drumbeat of terror. A cry ripped from her throat as she ran barefoot across the yard, sparks landing on her nightgown. Colton was already there, a giant silhouette against the roaring inferno. He wrenched the stable doors open, and a wave of black smoke rolled out. Without hesitating, he plunged into the chaos. Jessamine was right behind him. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. Her lungs screamed for air. The horses thrashed wildly, but Colton's deep, calm voice cut through their panic. He grabbed halters, leading them out into the yard where they galloped away, their coats steaming in the night air. Jessamine grabbed a trembling mare, murmuring to it, coaxing it through the smoke. Her hands, barely healed, were on fire again, the blisters tearing open, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't run. She knew who had done this. Crowder. The town's hate had been given a body. Their whispers had become the tinder, and Crowder was the match. If she failed now, everything she had fought for would turn to ash. Soon, only one animal was left. A young colt, trapped in a back corner, its eyes rolling white with terror. Jessamine staggered toward it, her vision tunneling. She reached the colt, grabbing its halter and pulling with all her might. It reared, nearly throwing her into a wall of flames. Then, strong arms were around her. Colton. He wrapped one arm around her and the other around the colt, and with a surge of impossible strength, he dragged them both out of the burning building. They collapsed in the yard just as the colt bolted free. Jessamine fell to her knees, coughing so hard she tasted blood. Colton dropped beside her, one arm still steadying her, as the roof of the barn caved in with a deafening roar. And then they heard voices. Through the smoke and haze, figures were emerging, the whole town. Drawn by the glow of the fire, they poured into the yard, their faces lit by the destruction. The same mouths that had spread the poison gossip now hung open in stunned silence. They saw the woman they had mocked, her face black with soot, her lungs torn, standing beside the giant they had feared. They saw them, not as outcasts, but as the only two people brave enough to run into the fire. Widow McGraw was there, her fan hanging limp in her hand. Deputy Calloway stared, his gaze not quite meeting Colton's. Jessamine pushed herself to her feet. She was unsteady, but she was not broken. She didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes found Colton's, and in that moment, a silent vow passed between them. She had walked through the fire, and she was still standing. The flames died down, leaving the blackened skeleton of the barn against the night sky. The townspeople lingered, waiting for... what? More drama? More scandal to justify their cruelty? None came. Instead, Colton straightened to his full height, his face streaked with soot, his gaze unwavering. He looked past the crowd, his eyes only on Jessamine. Then he did something that silenced them all. He reached for her hand. She placed her blistered, blackened palm in his without a moment's hesitation. Scars against scars. It was a gesture more powerful than any words, a public declaration, a covenant sealed in fire and survival. The crowd saw it. They understood. Their judgment, their whispers, their lies, it all turned to ash in that moment. For the first time, they were silent. The shame was theirs now. Jessamine lifted her chin, and her gaze finally swept across their faces. Her defiance was a physical presence in the yard. In her stillness, they saw the truth they had refused to see. Not a disgrace, not a scandal, just a woman of impossible strength. As the last embers faded, the townspeople began to drift away, their departure quieter than any sermon. Colton turned to Jessamine, his voice raw from the smoke. "You should rest." A faint, weary smile touched her lips. "So should you." They walked toward the house, their shadows long on the scorched earth. He carried a lantern, and its small, steady flame pushed back the darkness. As she stepped over the threshold, Jessamine knew the town's judgment no longer had any power over her. The fire had stripped everything away, but in the ruins she had found something more powerful than shame. She had found her home, not because anyone gave it to her, but because she had claimed it, hand in hand with the one man who saw her not as fragile or desperate, but as his equal and survivor. The prairie wind sighed through the charred beams of the ruined barn. Somewhere in the darkness, Crowder was hiding, his hate having failed him. The fight wasn't over. Justice had not yet been served, but the tide had turned. Jessamine closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt a peace that no fire could ever consume. They tried to burn her out, but all they did was ignite a light inside her that would never be extinguished. If you were captivated by this story of courage and justice in the face of prejudice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in Dry Creek.